In American history, there are stories we tell over and over again. We talk about the Revolution, the Civil War, the great battles for freedom. But what if one of the most brutal wars America ever fought, a war that killed over 200,000 people, was just erased? This wasn't some secret conflict fought in the shadows. This war helped define America's new role as a global power and involved shocking tactics in a bloody, years-long insurgency. And yet, for most of us, it's a ghost. This is the story of the Philippine-American War, a conflict that's been almost completely wiped from the nation's memory. And the real mystery isn't just what happened, but why we were made to forget. Our story really starts in 1898, not with a war, but with the hope of freedom. For years, Filipino revolutionaries led by the charismatic Emilio Aguinaldo had been fighting for independence from their Spanish colonizers. So, when the United States declared war on Spain, the Filipinos saw the Americans as powerful allies, as partners in the fight against tyranny. With encouragement, and even some help from American officials, Aguinaldo's forces took back control of most of the islands. By June 1898, they had the Spanish cornered in Manila and declared the First Philippine Republic, the first constitutional democracy in Asia. Freedom, for the first time, felt real. But half a world away, in the halls of power, a very different plan was taking shape. In December 1898, American and Spanish diplomats met in Paris to officially end the Spanish-American War. The Filipinos, who had done most of the actual fighting, weren't even invited. And in that meeting, Spain didn't grant the Philippines independence. Instead, it sold the entire archipelago to the United States for $20 million. The promise of liberation was a lie. The Filipinos hadn't found an ally. They had just swapped one colonial master for another. For Aguinaldo and his people, the betrayal was devastating. They had fought for their own freedom, not for a new set of rulers. The war for independence was far from over. The American public, still celebrating their splendid little war against Spain, mostly saw this new territory as a good thing. Politicians and pundits talked about a divine duty to civilize and Christianize the Filipino people, not to mention the massive commercial opportunities in Asia. They also worried that if America didn't take the islands, Germany or Japan would. They saw the Filipinos as children, incapable of governing themselves. What they chose to ignore was the fully formed republic that was already there. The breaking point came on the night of the 4th of February, 1899. An American private fired on a group of Filipino soldiers on a bridge in Manila, and just like that, a 3-year war was ignited. At first, the American military, with its superior weapons and training, dominated the conventional battles. U.S. commanders were confident this little insurrection, as they called it, would be over in a few months. But they had completely underestimated the will of the Filipino people and the brutal nature of the land they were trying to conquer. The war was about to get much, much uglier. By the end of 1899, facing constant defeat in open combat, Emilio Aguinaldo made a critical decision. He dissolved his army and ordered his men to melt into the landscape to fight a guerrilla war. The conflict was instantly transformed. Gone were the battle lines and formal armies. Now it was a war of ambushes, hit-and-run raids, and sabotage. Filipino fighters, often wearing no uniforms, would strike at American patrols and then vanish back into the dense jungles and mountains they knew so well. This new kind of war depended entirely on civilian support. Villages all over the islands became networks for food, shelter, and intelligence, which made it impossible for American soldiers to tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. Any farmer could be a fighter in disguise. Any village could be an enemy base. The American military was completely unprepared for this kind of war, bogged down in an unfamiliar jungle, fighting an enemy they couldn't see. It's for these reasons, the guerrilla tactics, the struggle to win hearts and minds, and the horrific counter-insurgency that followed, that many historians now call the Philippine-American War, America's first Vietnam. The parallels are chilling. Frustrated and unable to fight an enemy they couldn't find, the American military's response grew desperate and savage. The official policy of benevolent assimilation was replaced with a strategy of pure terror. To cut the guerrillas off from their civilian support, the U.S. military adopted shockingly cruel tactics. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Food and supplies were destroyed to create widespread famine. One of the most infamous policies was creating zones of protection, which were really just concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were forced into these disgusting zones, where disease and starvation killed thousands. Any Filipino man, woman, or child found outside these zones could be shot on sight. To get information, American soldiers used torture. The most well-known method was the water cure, a horrifying process where they forced a prisoner to drink gallons of water until their stomach was about to burst. Then, they would beat them or jump on them, forcing them to vomit it all out so they could start again. Letters from soldiers describing these atrocities started showing up in American newspapers, sparking outrage. This brutality hit its absolute peak on the island of Samar. After Filipino guerrillas killed 48 American soldiers in a surprise attack in the town of Balangiga, General Jacob H. Smith gave one of the most monstrous orders in American military history. "I want no prisoners." He told his men, "I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." When an officer asked what the age limit should be for killing, Smith replied that any male over the age of 10 should be executed. His goal, he said, was to turn the entire island of Samar into a howling wilderness. The fact that an American general gave orders like that is shocking enough. The fact that it's been almost totally erased from our history books is even worse. If you think these forgotten chapters of history need to be brought into the light, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We're dedicated to uncovering the stories that have been deliberately buried. Back in the United States, not everyone was on board with the war. A powerful anti-imperialist movement grew, arguing that it was a profound betrayal for America, a nation born from a revolution against an empire, to now become an empire itself. The Anti-Imperialist League had some of the most famous people of the time as members, including the millionaire industrialist Andrew Carnegie and the writer Mark Twain. Twain, who had at first supported the war against Spain, became one of its sharpest critics once he saw what America was really doing. He even became a vice president of the League and used his famous wit to attack the war. "I am an anti-imperialist," he wrote. "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." In a fiery essay called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," he blasted the hypocrisy of a nation claiming to spread freedom while waging a brutal war of conquest. But in the end, these voices of protest were drowned out by a wave of nationalism and the government's own propaganda machine. The war's turning point came in March 1901, when American forces used a trick to capture Emilio Aguinaldo. Though scattered fighting continued for years, President Theodore Roosevelt officially declared the war over on the 4th of July, 1902. Over 4,200 American soldiers had died. But for the Filipinos, the cost was catastrophic. An estimated 20,000 Filipino soldiers were killed, and as many as 200,000 civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. Some estimates put that civilian death toll much, much higher. So, this brings us back to that central question. How does a war this big and this brutal just disappear from history? The answer is complicated. First, it went against everything America said it stood for. The nation that threw off a king was now acting like a colonial conqueror. It was an ugly truth that didn't fit the heroic story America wanted to tell about itself. Second, military commanders actively covered up reports of the atrocities, and pro-war politicians downplayed them. The war was spun as a noble mission, and its victims were dehumanized to justify the violence. And finally, history is usually written by the winners. The story of the splendid little war with Spain was clean and simple. The bloody, morally bankrupt insurgency that came next was messy. It was just easier to forget it ever happened. The Philippine-American War is not just a forgotten conflict. It is an important and unforgettable lesson. It exposed the dark side of American power and the devastating human cost of empire. It showed how easily a nation betrays its own founding principles when power and profit are threatened. Remembering this war is not about blaming the people of today, it is about acknowledging the full, complex, and often painful truth of our history. It is about understanding that the ghosts of the past, like the howling wilderness of Samar, never really go away. They just wait for a new generation that is finally ready to listen. Thank you for accompanying Legacy Stories to the end of the story, and for your support. Please subscribe and like to help the channel grow.